I welcome you all to this first session. In the first session, we intend to start with an open and rather broad perspective. Open and broad in a twofold way. First, the three papers in this session reflect a multidisciplinary approach with a certain conceptual undertone. What is a sacred building in our modern or postmodern culture? How is the theme of our symposium explored from ritual studies, from culture studies, theology, practical theology, and liturgical studies? And a second dimension of the mentioned open and broad perspective concerns context. What is the role of cultural and religious dynamics? How can ritual space and place have a place in this culture? And before giving the floor to myself, a short remark on how we intend to organize this session. First, let us be open and honest on one thing. Talking about material place in a virtual, digital way is new for us all. It is very much an experiment. So let us learn by doing. We have in this session a chair, and in this session that's me, but also, and perhaps that's more important, there is a co-chair. And in this session, the co-chair is by my colleague, Johannes Stuckelberger. He will keep in touch with the chats and organize the questions in a so coherent and manageable manner as possible. And first we present the three papers one after the other. And after that, there is the opportunity that the speakers can respond to each other. And after that, the floor is open for questions and reactions from all the participants. And questions and remarks go by the chat function. Let's start. My paper has as a title, Recasting of Church Buildings. And let me start with three examples of reuse of church buildings from the Netherlands, cases with which I will illustrate my argument. First, we have here the Jumbo in Helmond. It's the former Benedetta Church, and it's a brick concrete church built in 1955 and was taken over by a supermarket chain, Jumbo. And note the advertising slogan, open every Sunday morning from 10 p.m., just like before. And this recycling project is still attracting international attention because of the striking contrast between the church and the supermarket. Here we see another redevelopment of a church, the Petrus in Vught. After more than 13 years of exploring, debating, it is at least in the Netherlands a famous and exemplary case of reusing a large redundant city church. The recasted neo-Romanesque monumental church from 1884 is shared by the city library, a theater, the local museum, the church workshop, meeting rooms, spaces for welfare organizations, creative workspaces, and a cafe and a restaurant. And at the entrance, there is a Virgin Mary chapel where you can light a candle. My third case is this church. And no, this is not an image of a Swiss Alp landscape. This is a small white church built high on an artificial hill at the edge of the suburb Leidseveen near The Hague. This is an art project by Laurens Kolk, and he reused the idea of a church to evoke the absence of churches in these new suburbs. And you can see it as a kind of folly or even an anti-church. The building cannot be entered. It has been reduced to its outward appearance, and there is an electrical system to ring bells. What I want to do in my 15-minute contribution is to formulate three notes that in my view can be useful for our symposium. Three notes from the podium of current ritual studies. First, a critical remark on terminology, or at least a note of a kind of a distinctio. In the concert of terms, herbestemming, hergebruik, Nieuwgebruik, Umnutzung von Kirche, Umbau, Transformation, Kirchen im Wandel, Nutzungserweiterung, reuse, refurnishing, adaptive reuse, creative reuse, reactivating. And in this concert of terms and concepts, I will add another one, recasting, to indicate both a specific form of ritual dynamic and reuse. The concept recasting has emerged in ritual and religious studies with an interesting and complex history in which terms inculturation and syncretism play a key role. One of the first scholars who introduced recasting in religious and ritual contexts was Leonardo Boff. He advocated a dynamic vision on ritual and religious change and transformation, labeled in the original Portuguese as refundição, from the Latin fundo, casting, melting. In English, recasting comes close to that. And in the context of our symposium, I see on the one hand reuse as an indication for simply recycling of churches, while on the other hand, recasting is aimed at a new contextualization, new appropriations. The view is now broader, not simply reuse is at stake, but recasting of church buildings is connected with the place and the manifestation of ritual sacred zones in our culture for new recastings. The Jumbo in Helmond is an example of simple recycling, not of ritual reuse, and not at all of recasting. The Petrus in Vught, however, is in my eyes a striking example of recasting. My second remark elaborates on the mentioned relation of recasting to the place and manifestation of ritual sacred zones in our culture. From a situational perspective, when we reflect on ritual space, we have to ask, what are, in our culture, the dominant sacred and ritual zones? And for that, I have been working with the so-called sacred ritual fields for a long time. See here a scheme with all the limitations of a scheme. The playing field of our rituals. We see the prominent, dominant ritual repertoires of our culture. Of course, the cycle of the year with the seasons and those of the axis of our lives. And in addition, on the top, the more current zones and repertoires. In our Western culture, I see there the domain of religion as institutional, traditional religion. Furthermore, the domain of memorial culture and that of art and culture and leisure culture, with as dominant subfields, tourism and sport. And my point is now this. The sacred is fluid and is situated in all these fields. All those cultural zones are fields of the sacred, and emerging new sacred spaces and places are rooted in all fields. Like the popular Camino, the old road to Santiago de Compostela is, at least before the pandemic, flowing through all the fields. Of course, it has to do with religion. It is also spiritual. It deals with the past. It has to do with living art and monuments, and it involves sport and tourism. And seen from the perspective of dynamic sacred fields, I see the Petrus in Vught as a ritual and sacred place. In all its new functions, it reflects the fields I've mentioned. We see that also in many often highly valued and prize-winning recasting projects. The recent recasting of the old Augustinian church in the center of Eindhoven as the Domus Dei ceremony house is a striking example. It is an open space for a variety of ceremonies, from music performances to weddings and funerals, feasts and festivals. And on the other hand, some religious repertoires seem to withdraw more and more into the isolation of the religious domain. And this often concerns very explicitly the church space in the Roman Catholic context. My third and last remark is applying ritual criticism to our theme. Ritual criticism is the critical attitude towards ritual, including ritual space and place. And that criticism can be informed by and aimed at the performance dimension or the context or the ideology, the strategies and the tactics. I thematize ritual criticism to imaging and framing and the role of church policy. First, the framing. The theme of church reuse often has ended up in a certain frame. The image is oft dramatic. Numbers evoke defeat, ruins, demolished church towers. The clock is ticking, the end is near. The frame is directly connected with secularization, with marginalization of religion. And sometimes that line is directly extended to the entire culture. And people see a general decline of values and culture. I think critical comment is here at place. That is not the frame that fits our theme. When it comes to religion, to culture, to the sacred, to ritual and religious space, there is no question of decline, but of change, of dynamics. And I guess we will talk these days about statistics and numbers. But as far as I know of figures for Europe, I can say this. Church closure figures are extremely contingent, especially when it comes to the future. And what I do see is that when it comes to church closures and church openings, and for me, a church is a religious space for ritual in the broad sense, the balance clearly goes to more churches instead of fewer. And in that increase comes from the cities and from the influx of migrants. Loss on the one side of what I call traditional churches and growth on the side of new emerging ones. The image is therefore more and not less churches in our society. And this picture is also confirmed in micro studies. Research shows that questions can be asked about the compelling causal line of less church attendance leads to church closure. It's also the other way around. Church closure leads to less church going and leads to loss of vital church community. A religious community is not an island, is not a vacuum, but is part of a local community. Research shows that less than 10% goes to the new church in case of a merger or closure. And this figure is especially important outside the cities, in the countryside. Here you see a map from the official website of the Archdiocese of Utrecht, the Netherlands. It dates from 2015, short after the presentation by the Cardinal of his pastoral liturgical plans for the future. And in general, the plan still stands. The Cardinal aims at the closing of most of the 285 churches, the red ones on the map, and the creation of perhaps of 10 or 15 so-called Eucharistic centers in 2030. Imagine the consequences of this policy for church communities, for village communities, for dealing with heritage. And this is not an inevitable slow disaster like a pandemic. This is 100% man-made. It has, together with many influences, directly to do with church policy. I could add many more critical perspectives about the process of reusing and recasting churches, about recasting as a process, about recasting as an open process, looking at ritual place as an open hermeneutical space for a plurality of appropriations and functions, and not one new use fits all. On the perspective of multifunctionality and zoning of space, and also open in time. A recasting can be momentaneous, temporal, and not for once and all time. like churches now function as a corona test or vaccination center. In short, recasting is not a massive and fixed enterprise, but is a flexible and complex process. I will conclude with an observation on a new form of recasting I see now in many places in Europe. In art projects and urban design and planning, I see references to the church, but also to the monastery or the abbey as a building type, as a bouwvorm, bouwtypos. I see that in that church in Leidseveen, where the type of a church is reused as a signal of the disappearing church in the city. But I see it also in Germany and Belgium. We see this recasting of an idea of the concept of a church. The so-called steel church in Borg-Loon, Flanders, Belgium, became a popular pilgrimage center, like the Notre Dame du Haut was and still is in France. And another example is the return of the monastery and the abbey as a building type through the so-called new city monasteries. The type of the church and the monastery is a source of inspiration, is redesigned in modern art and city planning. And I mentioned the work of Jurgen ten Hoeve, who, through the project Stadsklooster Rotterdam, Urban Monastery Rotterdam, designed a network of such places. And here you see the Clarissenhof in Tilburg. The reuse of the church building, not only as an idea or a dream or an historical reference, but as an inspiration for current and future architecture, gives hope. And thus I can close my 3 notes with a full and powerful perspective. And I hope that we can speak critically about all this and much more in dialogue. Thank you for your patience and attention. Okay, instead of questioning right now, we move on to the next paper. And I give now the screen and the floor to my colleague, SABRINA MÜLLER. She is a practical theologian from the University of Zurich, Switzerland. SABRINA, the floor is yours.
Thank you.
I hope it's working fine. I hope you can all see the PowerPoint presentation. I'm really delighted to be here and tell you more about multifunctional church use and fresh expressions of church. During the lecture of Mr. Post, I was delighted to hear that he said some very similar things. First of all, I would like to give you a number of examples in order to show you the logics of the ecclesial self-conception and the use of churches. So the structure of my presentation will be as follows. First of all, I will give you an introduction to the fresh expression of church, 2 examples from England, 1 example from Switzerland, and then there will be 4 ideas at the end in order to give you a summary of the ecclesial self-conception and the use of churches. Fresh expressions of church are new church communities that are not based on parishes, but are independent of local congregations. This term was first used in England, but now it has become a global movement. The Church of England consists of 2,500 to 3,000 fresh expressions. Unfortunately, I can't give you any figures for other countries. The term fresh expressions of church was coined in 2004 in the very well-known Mission-Shaped Church report. At that time, the authors of this report wanted to coin a term which represents new churches that are not polarizing, but rather act as a bridge between tradition and innovation. the new missions context and historical realities of the Church of England, and this term is particularly appropriate to describe this. The Church of England actually uses this term because it is part of the ordination vow, because all ordained people promise to convey the gospel in a new way to each new generation. And this is, of course, a challenge to ordained persons and a challenge to life or believers, and to translate this interpret this in a new way for each generation. There was also a new momentum due to the support of the former Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, because he also commented on the Mission Shape Church report, which has quite a big impact because he emphasized there are many ways in which the reality of the church can exist, and the territorial principle is only one of many. And in 2006, a definition was developed, which actually has become the common definition. I would like to focus on the blue highlighted terms because the fresh expression is a form of church for our changing culture, focusing on people who are not yet members of any church. So we have common values such as listening, service, incarnation, or mission. So focusing on the people and of course making disciples. It is also important that a fresh expression has the potential to become a mature expression of church. The primary focus of fresh expression is not that this is a new aspect, but that it needs to create the context and the interpretation of theology and spiritual experience. Loving service will always come before worship service. And this is also the main idea of the use of church buildings. Fresh expressions of church are very creative, but at the same time, they're also very pragmatic when it comes to the use of church buildings. I spent a number of research stays abroad, and I found out that many fresh expressions met at a pub, a bar, at a cafe, in schools, furniture shops, thrift shops, food banks. But of course, they also meet in cathedrals, in small, big, old, and new church buildings, as well as in parish halls. Fresh expressions of church, they use different buildings according to context. And what's also quite interesting, statistically speaking, this one refers to the fresh expression of church in England. 64% of these congregations, they use church buildings. And this is quite interesting actually to see. So what you can see is that 64% are used, also public buildings, and many fresh expressions use also a mixture of different estate, because in rural areas people use fewer church buildings than we may expect, but when it comes to cities, the percentage is higher than expected. And now I have 3 examples from England for you, how to reuse church buildings, and that it's Mood. Mood is a new monastic community right at the very heart of London. Actually, it has quite a long-standing history. It was a community, however, they did not have any buildings. Sometimes they used empty churches or empty halls, but they did not own any buildings themselves. And the church that you can see here, St. Mary's Alder Mary, is a church right at the financial center of London, which was no longer used as a church. And the Bishop of London wanted to sell this building, but then he realized that there is a community that needs a building. And so he asked the mute community whether they would like to use this building, and they thought about it, and then they moved into the building. But of course, this was also related to many challenges, because of course they were also responsible to maintain the building. St. Mary's Alder Mary was then reused, so now it's a church, a coffee shop, and outside of the building there were also a number of food stands in order to generate some funds. It is used for yoga, meditation, pastoral care. It is of course home to this new monastic community mood, so it means there is tradition, spirituality, everyday life, and also coffee culture. That's why one of their slogans is where coffee is a spiritual experience. So the atmosphere means that it is very conducive to dialogue and meditation. Then there is left bank leads. This is another example. You can see the church in the background that is used, which I'm going to explain to you. And this is also a young Christian community who didn't have a building. They met at different places, pubs, bars, event locations. And the church that you can see, the left bank church, actually was unoccupied for a number of years. And they didn't spend much money to buy it, but it was quite expensive to do the refurbishing, £2 million. First of all, they removed 2 to 4 containers of pigeon droppings, and of course, they collected some donations. What was quite important here is that the community had the feeling that they wouldn't really buy this building for themselves, but they wanted to find out about the need of the people living there. So what do these people need, and what can help reinforce their community? So this is a multifunctional use, creative culture, event location, sacral room. It's also a place for festivities, weddings. Then there's another example from Switzerland. It's called Open Place Kreuzlingen, and of course there would be a number of examples I could give you. It was founded in 2014 as a place to promote meetings between people. So there were actually different sites, and there was also a center, and most people wanted to meet at the center. So, and either they wanted to sell the buildings that were located at the periphery, or to found a new kind of building. You can see our pastor at the right-hand side, and at the center of the open place, the idea is that all people who would like to join us should be welcomed in these new buildings, so they should feel at home. So these rooms are supposed to be open to the neighborhood, open to the ideas that the people have that live there, because this means that the people working there, they don't invent any offers, but they just support what other people, what volunteers would like to offer. There is an English coffee shop, a place to speak and exchange language, the English language, and there is a special association that is called Verwertbar, and they collect food at supermarkets and redistribute this food. And this leads to 4 main ideas. First of all, this ecclesial self-conception and the multifunctional use of churches. So the first idea is death and resurrection, because often there is a community without buildings or empty buildings without a community. Sometimes empty churches are not sold, but they're given to these fresh expressions. So sometimes they are dead communities to speak, and people don't meet any longer, and then they try to revive these buildings. And this, of course, leads to an important question. So, do these existing buildings have to die first in order to reuse these rooms? So, do we need the death of this religious community first in order to create new religious communities? And then we have multifunctionality, because more often than not, these rooms are used by fresh expressions in a multifunctional way. So the theory is living space is turned into a place of worship, and the place of worship is turned into a living space. So it is very hard to separate these two. The lines are blurry, and both becomes the reality of these buildings and the people of fresh expressions. And then with the third idea, the place of worship becomes a place for religious experience and participation. Buildings used by fresh expressions become a room for experience, and people take responsibility themselves. And then we have the fourth point, contextualization, because church buildings try to express the aesthetics and the feeling of fresh expression of church, and of course, they also try to express the context. They speak the language of this network, and of course, they generate the profits, as we have seen with the left bank, lead bank. Fresh expressions of church are contextual churches that try to keep up a dialogue. This will lead to innovation, also innovation when it comes to the use of churches.
Okay, many thanks, Sabrina, for your paper. And we now have the third paper, and that will be by Albert GERHARDS from Bonn University. He gave me the floor several times on conferences on sacred space, and it's an honor that now I can give him the screen. Albert, the screen and the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much. Good morning, and I hope that you can see my screen, and I will continue in German.
So I'm going to speak about transformation of church spaces and as interactive processes, examples from Germany. Well, other disciplines have earned from space sociology that a space doesn't have to be something static, something very physical, but that it can be a social phenomenon. Regarding the church space, it's not just about the walls, but the relationships between the walls and the people that look at these walls. It's mainly about social interactions too. A church space, it's about the ritual references that are now in the focus thanks to ritual studies. So the focus is now more on social interactions and not so much about pure architecture. This is a very interdisciplinary approach. We are now talking about sacred topographies. We can reconstruct this from antiquity until today, and we talk about subjects that represent their society. They interact with the players and their actions based on staff changes, or maybe the taking over by a different group, or a change of the ritual organization. After a liturgical reform, the church space is changed, but remains where it is. Identity of a church building is thus the result of interactive processes. This is very briefly what we are dealing with in our research group, Sacred Room Transformation, and we deal with current reuses of churches. In March 2020, this project was started and is financed by a research group, and this deals with the processes of reuses and reuse cases in the process of interaction and interacting people and society. Regarding the building, the goal is to keep the integrity of the space as much as possible. This means to see the relations to the beginning of the building and not always give priority to a sacred use. Sometimes to be something for the public may be best served in a different use, for example, as a social use, than if you just reserve it for a specific religious group. But even if you choose a specific new use, a reuse, this building can't just be treated as a very static thing. But we have to ask how it can be seen in its new use, its new purpose, and how it relates to the various groups. And these may also be undergoing a change process. By an analysis of this change process and empirical research, we see specific processes at work, and we may be able to optimize specific aspects of this process. Regarding a theory, we are also dealing with the question whether the concept of the sacred is changing, has to change, if we need to change our definitions of the sacral. I would like to give you a couple of examples from Germany and comment on them. First of all is St. Maria Geburt Church in Aschaffenburg. This is now a space of encounter. This is not so much a reuse of churches, but a transformation process over a process of 20 years. And this has been accompanied by an artist the whole time. After a couple of experiences with this space, in 1999, they changed the space by Roland Ritter, an architect, and Leon Zuckmeier, an artist. And they radically changed this typical traditional church space. They changed the furniture and they tried to experiment with the room over various steps. And this has taken a final shape. And the former pastor, Markus Kraut, said, "Congratulations, we are done." So it was really good, this cooperation between a pastor and an artist that had similar ideas of a vision. And this was a process of 20 years' time, which is also supported by a very active congregation and their relationship to the space. The second example is Kreuzung an St. Helena in Bonn. This is now a dialogue space for Christian cult and contemporary culture. This was a very inconspicuous church in the middle of Bonn. It was built in the 60s by Emil Stephan and Nicolaus Rossini. So this was no longer used as a church, but it was never profaned, officially profaned. There was an association and they tried to find a new use, and they are now emphasizing the dialogue aspect in the new use. there are many different events organized by themselves or by other people, and they usually refer to the room, to the space, and you can see the altar, which is still there, it is kept, and they try to relate to this space and this furniture. But it's usually cultural events that are taking place there, or maybe social interactions. You can see the crypt here at the left-hand side, which is still being used as a sacred space. So there are current interactions between the space and the people and their actions. There are many interested parties that would like to have some kind of event there. And this is not just about the quality of the event, but also whether this is compatible with the space in itself and its program, its purpose. The third example, Stadtteilzentrum Q1, 1 im Quartier in Bochum-Stahlhausen. This is a social space, a neighborhood center. It used to be an evangelical church built by Ernst Buderus. And because the congregation became smaller and smaller, they had to give up this church. And in 2000, they already started reusing the church. And 15 years later, they found a completely new concept. This was a synergy between the church and funding programs from the city. And so they founded a community center. But the church in itself is still active. The church organization still uses this building, which is now a community center. And they have enlarged this building with more space. This is the room of silence. And this used to be the altar room and the sanctuary. And it's now for people to invite people of any kind of religion or spirituality. And it's also a space for interreligious, intercultural encounters. In this city quarter, there are many people with a migration background and, of course, with different religions. So this is reflected in this new use, and this Christian congregation had also had to deal with this fact. Now it's organized and kept by an intercultural organization funded by the Wüstenrot Foundation. So they won an award in 2016. First place for this new use, this new concept. And this was not just about architecture, but also because of the interactive quality of the transformation process. My fourth example, Digital Church in Aachen, the former Elizabeth Church. This is now a co-working space and event location. This is a quite spectacular example of a very interactive process. So it's been used as a digital church since 2016. It was built in 1904, this church. So they first started to use this opening section of the building for their own users, but then they stopped using the building altogether and sold the church building to an investor. Once it had been profaned and rededicated, they tried an interim solution for half a year as a hotel. And with the help of students, especially students from the universities in Aachen, they tried a new marketing concept, but also they tried to establish a place for encounter and social change. This was funded by public and private funds. The new owner then had a new concept in an interactive process, and they involved former members of this congregation and people from the neighborhood. So they wanted to keep this former church as a place of encounter for the neighborhood. Digital Hub was now involved and transformed this into a co-working space. The central nave can also be used for conferences or for events. This building is still listed, so it has kept its sacred character, But at the end, the congregation said goodbye to this building. The chance for dialogue between a modern use and religion that would wanted to be kept by the current owner, but this was not taken on by the other groups involved. My fifth example, if a work is a work in progress, which is St. Maria Als in Stuttgart. It was built in 1879 in Stuttgart, and this is the biggest example. We have maybe 90 people who go to church on Sunday. That's maybe 1/10 of the space available. So it was damaged in church, and it, you would need a lot of funding to maintain this church building. And the question is if this is worth it, all this money for only 90 people. But then a group formed, an interest group formed, to come together to use this church as a spiritual, but also as a cultural center, and to save this church. They started in 2017 with the question, well, we have a church. Do you have any idea what to do with it? So in 2018, this initiative, St. Maria Als, they have taken this on, and they tried to gain experience with the church building with the nave as a hybrid space. And the chapel is still being used for worship. And they gain a lot of experience in these first years, what they want to do in the future with this building, because the sanitation, the restoration will take place in 2023. I'm now coming to the end. These 5 examples tell us a lot about the meaning of interactive processes. It's always singular. For example, it's always something individual, how old the building is, the situation in the city, who is involved, the stakeholders. It's always an individual situation. But there are some factors which can also be constant. First of all, affirmation of the spiritual, cultural, social added value of sacred spaces by the first owners. Secondly, the exploration of the potential of the space and the social environment. Thirdly, the synergies of initiatives with other interest groups that have been ignored so far. And fourth, a courage to do something new and the patience that you need. So in this context, you shouldn't just see this as a loss, that the church is no longer a church, but can also be an added value, can lead to further chances, opportunities, not just for investors, but also people may benefit from this by using this space in a new room, whether they may be Christian or not. Thank you very much.
Many thanks for these contributions, and I myself have the feeling that we are in the middle of the theme of our symposium. In the first round, I now ask SABRINA and Albert to have a first reaction after hearing the papers. Who can I give the floor first? SABRINA, perhaps?
Thank you very much. I have already touched upon this when listening to Paul Post's presentation, this difference between a shopping mall and other uses. This is what you can find with the fresh expressions of church. So these are very small examples of this overlapping of new users and multifunctionality. And this is what Mr. Gerhard has also mentioned. And I think this applies to many countries and disciplines. And that is why this is great that we meet here today, because we can think about it. These phenomena can be found in many different countries. And what I've also heard is, so we have this religious and spiritual place, But then there's also the economic idea, the sacral idea, and the profane idea, and this all is supposed to meet and to come together. So the first impression is not about differences, but what all of this is united by.
Thank you. Albert, perhaps a first reaction?
Well, I have learned two terms, recasting, this is a term from Paul, because it's great to have this category. And then the fresh expression. I think this is quite a positive term. When thinking about what this is all about, then this is a positive term referring to the future. As what we've heard in this disciplinary dialogue, and I'm sure that we will be able to develop this. And maybe this is a problem that is typical of Catholics and of Germany, because and the Catholic Church needs to be aware of this, and we need to find out how to communicate this.
Okay, thank you. From my side, 3 remarks, and then I go to the chat box with Johannes Stuckelberger, and then we have an open discussion with the questions that has come through by chat. First remark is that I see perhaps a little bit difference in the perspective. How do you approach the problem of the redundant churches? So fresh expression is for me a very theological, a very church, and also perhaps a little bit normative approach. But perhaps it isn't meant like that, but that is the feeling that I have when I see this text of the Church of England. Second remark is about concepts. I heard the concept sacred topography, sacral topography, and also the sacred. And it's of course important, what do you mean by this? What is the sacred? How religious is the sacred in the discussion about churches? And also, Albert, you are using the terminology integrity of space. And that's also, what is that? What do you mean by the integrity of space? Is this also a very normative concept, or is it a cultural open concept? So there's questions for me when I heard these very interesting papers. But we can discuss this later. And now perhaps, Johannes, can you bring in some questions after the papers in the plenum?
Well, we haven't collected a lot of questions yet.
Thank you very much. A most interesting approach. Food for thoughts.
Thank you.
We have very specific questions. 2 questions are directed to SABRINA MÜLLER.
Some ideas of fresh expression come close to Luther's understanding of churches.
And Luther is quoted. So it's not supposed to speak the work of God. But if we want to meet there, then we can also speak to the people outside at the well.
Luther didn't probably know what sort of places are skateboardplätze.
Well, of course, Luther is a good thing to quote. This is, I can also find this in the Zwingli approach, if we speak about the Methodist Church, fresh expressions might be part of this movement of contextualization, putting a church close to the people. So I definitely can concur here. But of course, Luther has also to be put into context, and you need to see the bigger picture and the timeline, and then there might be some things that do not fit. But basically, it's true. Then there's a second question to you regarding the open place in Kreuzling. This is a very encouraging example, the Kreuzling example, but how can the parish actually fund this building that is no longer used for sacred purposes? Well, in Switzerland, we're actually quite lucky, so there are always some funds left. So the open place, for example, they also earned some money by running this coffee shop, and there are volunteers working there. So actually, people fund this building, and there are some, well, revenues that we have. So the community really is responsible. This has not always been the case. In 2016 or 2017, it was quite difficult to explain what we do and why this is really part of the church in order to show our legitimation. In the Thurgau canton, for example, there was a new job created in order to support these initiatives. And again, it's about this interaction between communities and buildings. Then there's another question to Albert Gerhard. The denomination Catholic, Protestant, do they have an impact on how these projects are actually implemented? Well, when it comes to the Catholic Church, of course, you need to differentiate here, because this is what Ms. Post said, and you have to differentiate between the different dioceses. Well, sacral is a term that needs to be interpreted in one way or the other. Can we use this church for different purposes? Is this possible? So of course, the Catholic Church, they have some, they're getting closer because people tend to understand better that multifunctional use is good. There's this open church initiative, but the Catholic Church, on the other hand, well, you can see quite well if you use it only for people to attend the church and for masses, then it's a pity if you don't use it for social or spiritual purposes. And by the way, there is a historical background to this, because the secular use of churches is something that we saw quite often in the past, in the 19th century, for example. Well, studies show that the church buildings were not only used for religious purposes only, and what we've seen today is that nowadays people try to rediscover church buildings as a meeting place. And today we have this multicultural and multi-denomination approach. A question to Paul Post.
Please, could you take up this question of what is the sacred. If everything is sacred, then nothing is sacred anymore.
Yes, that's true. I think I have touched a little bit on it in my short context when I was presenting that scheme with sacred ritual zones. So for me, the sacred is not only the religious sacred. It can be also what I've told the other zones in our culture where the sacred is presented as a notion of things that you set apart, things that are holy for a group or for a person. So I have a very broad and open perspective on what you can call the sacred. And when you get a discussion about a sacred space, it's important to know what your partners in the discussion mean by the sacred. And a lot of misunderstandings comes in when one partner is thinking about the sacred as the religious sacred, and more specifically, the religious institutional sacred. And another partner has this broad open perspective on the sacred. So that's, I think, an important element in debating on reuse and redesigning church spaces.
So there are two final questions. First of all, a comment from Italy.
The transformation of churches is not a recent phenomenon. Churches have always been transformed in Italy. I could diagnose a major transformation of the interior circa every 150 years. We should not be afraid to continue this history as long as we keep the integrity of the individual space.
So again, the question is, what do you mean by the integrity of the individual space?
Albert, you were using this terminology.
Yeah.
Well, the program of our research group, Sacred Room Transformation. So integrity means something very dynamic. We consider it to be a dynamic category. Well, you maintain a sacred space, one if it is transformed. Because if you look at historical church buildings, you will see that you can only maintain a room if you transform it. So the question is, well, when is the room really changed, or when can it be maintained as a room in the church? And is this room going to lose this sacred identity? So the question is, what is the identity of this room? So that is why we need to have a definition here, because sometimes the building is maintained as a physical building, but later it might be restored in a way that it becomes a church again. In Essen, for example, there's a church where exactly this has happened. But basically, let's say the main focus is we maintain at least a part of these building structures, but you won't recognize it any longer because there's such a big transformation and you can't see any relation to the former church building. Then, of course, you lost the identity of this building, and then it doesn't matter whether you demolish the building, whether you maintain the building, because in this case you can easily replace it. So this is what I understand when referring to the integrity of the building. So you may have a new function, but if it's no longer a sacred room, even if you transform it, then of course, well, you don't need to discuss any longer.
Allow me to add one thing, one experience on this terminology of integrity. I've presented the Jumbo supermarket church in Helmond, and I have some interesting discussions with people from the Heritage Agency in North Brabant. And they were using this terminology of the integrity, sorry, the integrity of the space. They were very happy with this supermarket because the integrity of the space was saved, in their opinion. You take out the supermarket and you have the building like it was before. And another use of the terminology integrity was in the Vught example, the multifunctional city church of Vught. There also the terminology, the concept integrity was used because people found that the use of the church as a restaurant, as a library, as a theater was also concerning the integrity, the sacrality of the church. And so here you have two different approaches of integrity. So for instance, for me, in the supermarket example, there is a slight different use of integrity as in the case of the Vught multifunctionality church. So also here you see this interesting tension using the word integrity, like when people use the terminology of sacredness and the sacred.
And of course, you need to discuss this again and again. I was referring to the digital church that also maintains the integrity of the room. And we were looking into this, and people working there, well, they ask questions, but no one answers these questions because the church has withdrawn from the project. Let's say they still have a room of reflection, then the situation might be different, and the owner is actually quite sad. In Bochum-Stahlhausen, for example, this room has been completely transformed, but they were able to maintain the integrity because this room of silence and the presence of the Protestant church have managed to keep up this link, even though it is an intercultural space and very open space. So when it comes to the definition of the integrity of the room, you always need a new definition, a new interpretation, because there will always be a new approach according to the solution that you found. Johannes? Well, would you like to continue? There are more questions, of course. Or well, I will read out two more questions. There is a question to SABRINA MÜLLER. Are there fresh expression of church examples from rural areas? Because sometimes there are redundant churches that could be reused. Yes, there are many fresh expression examples in the rural area. It's not an urban phenomenon. You can find this in many different regions, many different examples, how they are being reused in a rural area. I had another example of messy churches. This is another example how you can use churches in a multifunctional way in rural areas, because they often use it as a meeting place, a creative place. There's one example I would like to give you from a rural area in Norfolk, England. People found out that people, they are very hesitant entering a church building, and they really try to use this for, well, school purposes, food stands, and it's very important to help people to enter this building and to turn this sacral sacred space into everyday life space. And listening to your discussion, well, I had to smile because left bank leads, for example, is a very specific example. And the question is, well, how long is it going to be a sacred space? And they were quite open and they rented out this room. And then they found out that it was used in the SM scene. And then they really need to discuss, well, for what purposes can we use these rooms, and are there purposes that we have to exclude? And this was quite an interesting example. Well, this is a problem when selling these buildings. In 2009, a church in Osnabrück was sold, and the seller was not sure how to reuse this church building, and now it was turned into a gym actually. And the gym actually says, well, this is a former church building, so this former sacred space, well, is used in a way, well, you can see Jesus and, well, wearing, and instead of his heart, you can see a dumbbell. So they kind of used to play with these religious symbols, and I'm sure that the parish, the congregation, does not like this. So of course, if you sell such a building, then you really need to find out how this is going to be used in the future. This is quite a delicate topic. Is this okay? Can we accept this? Is this something we have to deal with? Is this really part of the multifunctionality that we can accept? So, because in the past, this might have been called blasphemy because you were referring to the SM scene, and I think this might be also part of it. And I think I have some restraints here.
Yes, I have two more questions, but there are a couple of questions that are not so much regarding the perspective of the cultural studies. It's rather about the post-war churches, questions regarding the monument protection. I would suggest that we keep these questions and maybe hand them over to the second section, where this is more about architecture and the cities. But there are two topics from the questions I have seen I would like to mention. One is still regarding the question of what exactly is the sacred? What is sacred? Paul, to you.
How would your concept of sacred apply to a co-working space?
And maybe second question. Paul paused. Maybe you could again explain the difference between recycling and recasting.
Eine Bemerkung dazu, the Dutch researcher Dan Bekers introduced the term sacred residue for the material and immaterial left behind after the church has left its building.
And then the second aspect is, what about the discussions with the church leadership and the reuse? So what's the discussion like regarding the reuse, the discussions with the church leadership and others that don't belong to the church? These may be questions that are relevant.
Okay, before Albert and Sabrina can approach these questions, some notes from my side. The sacred and co-work spaces use for me is that the perspective of multifunctionality. So for me, you can have a sacred space when there is not only perhaps some ritual dimension like the Virgin Mary Chapel in Vught, but also other uses like a theater, a library, a third world shop, and a cafe restaurant. For me, that also is ritual sacred space. And when you bring that together in a space that is original, a sacred space, because it was a church, then you have, I think, the perspective of what I call recasting. And recycling or reuse is simply the recycling of a building. That can be a supermarket, that can be a sports center or whatever. But for me, there is a difference. And with recasting, I try to bring in the perspective that we used to bring in via terminology like inculturation. But I think inculturation is not a right concept anymore, because it suggests that you have one element of culture that you bring in another element of culture. And now we have an understanding of culture as a dynamic system and not as a fixed, static, non-changing, non-transforming system. So perhaps the terminology of recasting is also connected to the term of SABRINA, the terminology of refreshing, of bring in a church in a new context. And so there is an interrelatedness between speaking about the sacred, about multifunctionality, and the concept of recasting.
Yes, I was saying that for many people, shopping may even be a religious act, a ritual act. So in that case, even a shopping mall in a church may be maybe a sacred or a ritual use for these people. So where is the limit?
But that's
Also, wo ist die Grenze? Wo ist die Grenze?
That's why I have tried to formulate 4 sacred fields or zones in our culture where I see, and I'm not inventing that, where I see that people see a dominant ritual presence in modern culture. And I have not a circle made, or I've not presented a field of the shopping mall. But I know that in, perhaps for some people, shopping is an holy act, but for me, that's not a sacred ritual zone. And I think for many people in Western culture.
Yes, I totally agree with you. But I don't know, for me, it's difficult to really see where the border is. Where do you define the border between the two? I think this concept of the sacred needs to be enlarged, needs to be redefined. But I'm wondering how you can really legitimize where you put the border between what's sacred and what is not.
And I try to do that by describing certain dominant sacred ritual zones in our culture. And we see that people experience the sacred, people present and express themselves in rituals, in the cycle of the year, feasts and festivals, on the axis of their lives, from birth rituals to funeral rituals, and in the 4 fields I have presented. And there, in this way, it's not totally open what is sacred, but you describe certain zones. And that is also the case when Dan Bakers in his book speaks about the religious or the sacred residue of buildings, that in certain buildings, mosques or former churches, there is still the presence of this relation to the sacred.
Yep, okay.
But on the other hand, you are also right. It's open when you say the sacred is not only the institutional religious sacred. Then you made it. Then you make it open, and that yeah, there are no strict boundaries then anymore.
Yes, the second topic was about the discussion with the church leadership, but I would suggest that we maybe do this in another session because there will be more time and space for that. There are so many more questions regarding the question of what is sacred. But maybe it's not so easy to define. Yes, I'll leave that to you. There is another answer within the chat. The interpretation of a shopping as a religious ritual is a definition that people usually wouldn't express themselves. You need some clear border, not the very fuzzy and vague definition. Yes, I have a different contextual approach. What I see is that these fresh expressions that they usually have to negotiate this themselves, this concept of what is sacred at this very space and what isn't. So these words like tradition and context are so central. They are very key because they help these congregations in this negotiation process. And I would say that they may lead to different questions in each individual situation. Other important questions, Johannes? Wes, yeah, there's a very important question from the perspective of monument preservation. The integrity of the space, this is something you talked about, but this is also defined by the monument protection. The authenticity of the perspective of monument protection, this definition of integrity is independent of the use. Integrity, authenticity always has to be defined for each specific monument and case. Yes, I mean, this is why we are including this in our program, because of course we are also dealing with monument protection. Because after all, it guarantees that a monument, any kind of construction, any building will be kept in its integrity. And of course, it has to be negotiated in each case. And this is why the monument protection has to be included. And they're usually willing to compromise so that a building can be kept in a certain way and can be kept, can be maintained through this reuse. This is why this is always a negotiation process. But of course, they will have to say something to the monument protection representatives.
Perhaps, Johannes, still a remark about the church policy and church community. There was a question about that,
Yeah.
and we will discuss that later in other sessions, of course. But my experience in the Netherlands is that this multi-functional recasting perspective is not so much appreciated in Roman Catholic contexts. And and there we have, I think, really a problem in bringing in a multifunctional perspective for redundant churches. So, for instance, I have presented this case of the Archdiocese of Utrecht. So there, the bishop, the cardinal in this case, is very reluctant to have this perspective of multifunctionality in his church buildings. And there you have on the background, of course, a specific sacramental view on sacrality. And that's really a problem, because it's so fundamental in talking and making policies about, in this case, nearly 300 church buildings.
Yes, we heard this Italian contribution, and they said that this reuse of churches is a historical phenomenon which has been done before. I'm thinking of Naples, where there was a huge number of churches that are empty because they just have so many churches in Naples. And the Archbishop is quite free, and he is free to, hand these buildings over to initiatives, to groups who can do nearly what they want. I saw it a while ago when I was there, and they give new life to these churches. They are free to do that. And so these thresholds to do something else, but just spaces for prayer, is different than to us. And you would wish the same for a cardinal of Utrecht, that he would see the same. To maybe see this as an example, what is possible, so that there is a potential to hand it over to the public, that it can be used, it can be offered as a space for life. And this can then enrich the whole life of the community. So maybe you would need to go back to the universalism of our European richness of our churches and see what people do with it.
I will give him your mail address and the link to your research program. Perhaps that's going to help. Johannes, perhaps we have to round up and present some practical remarks from your side, or are there very important questions or remarks in the chat?
Yes, we don't need 4 minutes for that. So if there is a need from your side to summarize anything, to say something else, then I think we'll have some time. We have about 2 minutes left for that. SABRINA, any last remarks? Yes, well, I'm coming from a practical theological approach. And what I can see and observe is something that we have seen in the examples, is this multifunctionality. And you always need to expect it to be adapted to the context. Something I keep seeing is this phenomenon that it may be totally dead at the beginning, the building is sold, or that the building is still kept and then something new comes in. And I always would like to support the openness to think about new possibilities together with the monument protection and also the congregations in the neighborhood, that you can have create new things before everything is gone, and to use this potential at that time. Albert, any final remarks? Yes, I can only agree what you just said. That's also a chance, an opportunity for this congregation to be active in this transformation process and to grow in this process and to renew. I think that's quite useful, this approach. So for these 2.5 days, we are on the right path to this. Yes, I agree.
I have 2 remarks. First, for the discussion in other sessions, I think it will be also important to have an eye for what I call ownerships. In all the examples I saw, I think it's important who owns the building, who are the partners, and that influences very much the perspective for what I call recasting. And the other element is about the discussion about sacredness and integrity and boundaries of the sacred. I would like to refer to my handout on the platform of the Symposium. There is a handout, and there I have brought together some literature about these visions on what is the sacred. Once more, thanks to the speakers in this session. And now I close this session and thank you for being with us.